Good afternoon, all. Welcome to UBA Africa Day Conversations 2020, themed Growth, Jobs, and Sustainable Development amidst a global pandemic. We expect hundreds of thousands of views on this special convening. This convening will be in two parts. I will moderate the first session. Then I will hand over to my co-moderator, Eugenia Abu, who will introduce the eminent African ladies, gentlemen, serving as panelists on the second session. In this session, we will be defining Africa's response to COVID-19, growth, jobs, and sustainable development amidst a global pandemic. We welcome our esteemed panelists, world leaders who have accepted to join this conversation today, because we collectively agree that the priority for Africa must be safeguarding our youth and ensuring creation of jobs and economic opportunity even during this difficult time. Let me introduce the panelists for the first session. His Excellency President George Weah, President of Liberia, Senator Chris Coons, U.S. Senator and member of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Peter Mora, President, International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, Akim Stener, Administrator, United Nations Development Program, UNDP, His Excellency Ambassador Georges Robelo Pinto Chikoti, Secretary General of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, ACP, Professor Oke Ben Orama, President and Chairman of Africa Export-Import Bank, AFREZIM, and Mr. Amir Ben Yamed, President and CEO of Africa Forum, Africa CEO Forum. I thank you, our esteemed panelists, as we look forward to an interactive engagement this afternoon. Let me also recognize my good friends, Donna Keruka, current High Representative for the African Union Peace Fund and former President of African Development Bank, AFDB, and Hasham Al-Arab, Chairman of the Board of Commercial International Bank, Egypt, CIB. I encourage our audience to ask questions throughout the conversation using hashtag UBA Africa Day Conversations and UBA Africa Day 2020 on all social media platforms. I will allow each panelist to share 60 seconds opening remarks before we begin interactive discussion in this order. President George Weah, Senator Coons, Mr. Peter Mora, Akim Stener, Secretary General Chikoti, Professor Keorama, and Amir Benjamin. So let's start with President George Weah. President George Weah, you have 60 seconds, please, to give your opening remarks before we begin the interactive discussion. Over to you, please. You're muted, President George Weah. You're muted, please. President George Weah, you're muted, please.
Well, first of all, I want to greet my colleagues, the panelists, And I want to extend a special thanks and appreciation to you, my brother Tony Olumelu, and for inviting me on this panel in a very important discussion on the way forward COVID-19. I accepted this invitation because I know the importance and I knew that the world will be coming together to listen. So we share ideas how we move forward from the COVID-19 and share ideas how it affects all of us. I want to wish you the Africa Day today, and I hope that our deliberation will be in the interest of our people that are suffering from this pandemic, and then our discussion will be on the way forward, what needs to be done. So I'm honored. Again, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, my dear friend Tony, for the invitation. To Your Excellency, the President of Liberia. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today as we talk about our global response to this pandemic. We have worked together well in response to previous pandemics, to the challenges of HIV/AIDS, of tuberculosis, of Ebola. And it is my hope that in the United States, where we are struggling mightily with this pandemic, we have as many Americans have died so far from this pandemic as there are reported cases on the continent of Africa. I remain, as you know, Tony, an optimist about Africa. I believe that it has a bright and strong future. And I look forward to our conversation today about how we can work together to make the investments that we need to make now in response and recovery to this pandemic, in building the foundation for rapid and sustained economic growth, and to invest in the youth of Africa so that we have a brighter future for the continent and for the world. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Peter Mora?
Well, from my side as well, congratulations to Africa Day, and thanks to my co-panelists. I think from a humanitarian perspective, just a few points. We recognize today that pandemics comes on top of many other challenges Africa has. It is first a medical issue, but it must not be treated as a medical issue only. If I look at Africa, our first challenge today are the secondary impact of the pandemic, the impact on the economy. So what is the response? I think twofold. We have to discuss, as Senator Coons said, how we cooperate together and how we can marry short-term emergency humanitarian assistance with innovative, community-built, private-public sector cooperations and partnerships, market creations, job creations. And I think we have to see and comprehend this response as a value chain to which each and every one of us has to add something.
Thank you, Peter. Akim, please.
Tony, thank you very much, Excellency President Weah, distinguished panelists. It's a great privilege to join you, Tony, and such an extraordinary group of people on the occasion of Africa Day. And I want to begin by first of all expressing my sympathies to all those who have already lost family members, friends, and colleagues to this virus. This global pandemic is in some ways still arriving in Africa. And I think a second observation is a great credit to many governments and the people on the continent of Africa of how they have responded to this challenge, unprecedented with limited means, but yet being able to contain the virus for the moment. But as we have seen, and this is why I'm so keen to join you for this discussion today, this virus has almost been overtaken in terms of a health crisis by the economic and social impact it is having on the continent. And therefore, the development gains of the last decades, in particular the last decade, on the continent of Africa are obviously now at risk in very human terms, in economic GDP terms, but also in terms of the future prospects. And therefore, UNDP is a proud organization with a long history of working alongside African countries and communities. And I hope that in today's discussion, we can find that perspective to the future that hopefully will also drive the kind of innovation that Africa has so often shown and that we are now all committed to trying to pursue in these very difficult times. So Tony, thank you for the invitation and great to join you on Happy Africa Day.
Thank you very much. Secretary Chikoti.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody. Good afternoon to His Excellency President Weah. Let me thank you for inviting us to this meeting on the 25th of May, which is the Africa Day. I think it's very important that at a crucial time like this one, we have a meeting like this one where we can discuss about the challenge that Africa faces with the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that as we discuss this, what will be important is to make sure that we come out of this meeting stronger. I think that Africa should show leadership in combating the consequences of the pandemic on our economies. Our societies have particularly been deeply affected by this pandemic. And as most of our colleagues have already mentioned, the fact that we have come out of this, we'll come out of this pandemic poorer and with more challenges to confront our upcoming societies. We've got to be able to look at the future with better perspectives. I think this meeting should be able to propose something tangible for our societies as they come out of this particularly difficult situation. Our societies have been affected in all areas of their economies. The commodity prices have fallen, fiscal revenues, foreign exchange receipts fallen, financial flows fallen, and it's a total disruption of our economies. So I think that as we discussed today, we'll be looking at how well we can respond better to make our youth be able to find better jobs or to be able to have societies that are stabler in terms of our social challenges. I think that this also allows us to be looking at the 2030 development goals, and I think that we need to look at how well we can come out with improved governance and looking at a better future for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Before Professor Rama, please, distinguished panelists, when we are not speaking, we can mute our devices so that it won't interrupt much. Okay, Professor Rama, please, your intro, the mic.
Thank you very much, my brother Tony. And let me also thank His Excellency President Weah and the distinguished panelists on this program today. Thank the UBA for creating the opportunity for us to have this discussion. Today is Africa Day. It reminds each and every one of us Africans of the collective need to be together, to reaffirm our faith in our continent and ourselves. This year's Africa Day is somehow overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic. But beyond that shadow, we must see the other positive message it brings. What COVID-19 has taught us is that there comes a time when every group of people fend for themselves. There comes a time when you must be independent. We hope, and I hope, that the message that this COVID-19 is teaching us about independence will help us to integrate our continent better, so that we trade better, invest amongst ourselves better, and promote our growth and development as a people without always looking out for others to bail us out. I look forward to having a lively discussion today.
Thank you, Professor Rama. Thank you. Mr. Amir Benjamin. Amin?
Yes. Thank you, Tony, for this invitation. I extend my greetings to all the fellow panelists that are here with us today. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of the private sector views on how to fend off this pandemic. But more than that, I hope we will be able to talk on how this how we can capitalize on this crisis to seize new opportunities and create a new Africa, stronger economically, and above all, one of the themes which is, I think, one of the most important things in the coming month, self-reliant. So thank you again for this invitation and happy Africa Day.
Thank you very much. Riding on what our great panelists have said so far, to add my own appreciation and commendation to the Group Managing Director and CEO of UBA, Mr. Kennedy Soka, for making this possible. We'll now go to Mr. George Ware, President George Ware. Your Excellency, in your viewpoint, as Liberia has fully recovered from civil wars and Ebola, how can African leaders finally use this opportunity, this crisis, to propel a new African order, where our economy is built on a more resilient foundation? Your Excellency. And I can add to that why you're setting up to say, how are African governments supporting the African private sector during this crisis to create growth, jobs, and sustainable development? You're muted, Your Excellency. You're muted, Your Excellency.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Your Excellency.
Yeah, no. Yeah, but thank you again, my good friend and Tony. Let me wish you African Day again. I know this is your day, but I think how are African governments supporting the private sector during this crisis? Because that's the question. For us here in Liberia, our government, due to our government bilateral relationship and position, has allowed our government to mediate between banks, businesses, and other partners to manage loan repayment schedules and mitigate other financial hurdles, creating stimulus packages for citizens, which alleviate some of the financial and social burden placed on individuals due to slowdown in regular business activities. In Liberia, we have taken some measures to ease the burden on vulnerable small businesses in the informal sector, as well as big businesses. We are in the process of providing small loan assistance to petty traders and other marketers. In addition, we are working with commercial banks to mediate repayment of loans, because we know that the pandemic has shattered almost everything, and people lose their jobs, businesses are shut down. The only way they can grow is for us to help them and implement these things that are outlined to help them to gain a growth. And also some of the things we did here were able to make sure that we didn't have total lockdown because we know that we're in a country where our economy is a tough time in our economy. And so we did not do total lockdown. We just ease by giving some time. People leave 6 o'clock in the morning to come back home 3 o'clock. And then, of course, because of the way that people even in the short time, it's difficult for them to gain growth on the various produce. We had to make sure that we bring it to 6 o'clock so they can be able to work at least to be able to sustain while we're going through this pandemic. So that so far we're doing our best to make sure that they are sustained, because some people take loans from banks, they can't even pay the banks, and the market shut down. So we have to take the responsibility to make sure that we repay their loans, and also when they come back to the marketplace, they will not be running from banks.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you. Let me turn to His Excellency Ambassador George Chikoki of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific Group of States, ACP states.
Thank you very much.
The ACP states are most vulnerable to the pandemic, and their governments face hard choices about where to direct our limited resources. Where and how, Your Excellency, should governments invest their limited resources to avert the worst and build a better future for our people?
I don't know whether I got you correctly well, but what I wanted to say is that we have been doing quite a number of things.
Okay.
At the beginning of the pandemics, through the Inter-ACP, we have been able to release $25 million to all member states. Right now, we are still working together if we can release another $189.5 million to all members of the OACPS. So what I think will be the challenge is to make sure that all those most vulnerable countries should be able to receive as much help and support as possible. I was listening to His Excellency President George Weah, who is talking about what the government has been able to do in their regions. We have got to understand that in our regions, we have countries that have lost completely all their economies. That means, for example, the tourism industry, the hotel industry is completely collapsed. On the other hand, in most of the countries, we have a lot of people who are self-employed. And again, if you have these people at home, that means they will not work. So that means that food security has also been very much impacted. So I believe that what, as an international community, we have got to do is to see how well we can support countries and communities to be able to respond better, to provide food for themselves, but as well as they come back to see how they can get better jobs or they can get jobs and how we can help them. How can we fund all these efforts? I believe that one of the major challenges now is to make sure that in all countries we have improved governance. We've got a strong agricultural growth, including the reduction of, including high productivity. We've got to look at the employment and including skill set development that addresses the employment of youth and, of course, the vocational training of youth. We've got to improve the private sector that engages with societies, but as well it's important that there is peace and security in our country. We can also digitalize better at a greater pace so that ICT technology becomes accessible in many countries. Last week, I participated in a jury that was selecting young people from across our countries in Africa and in the island states. And we felt that there is a very strong commitment of the youth to do better and to work. But these projects need to be funded. And I think that it's important that what we should learn from the impact of the COVID-19 is that the international community, the world at large, and particularly financial institutions can look at how well they can fund or support all these initiatives that can come from our countries. Because I believe that the impact goes beyond the responsibility of governments. Governments were unaware of what would be the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on their countries. And today, the challenges they are coming up, that will come up, are so high that they need more support. And probably we need to discuss a little bit more details in terms of detail to make sure that the private sector plays a good and big role, and that governments accept that it is indeed a challenge that needs to be lifted all together and across with everybody. We need to listen to each other and make sure that what we propose for societies really get to those people who have been fully impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you very much. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Tony. Again, happy Africa Day. Can you hear me?
Yeah, as a member of the United States Senate and in your role as ranking member of the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health Policy, I'd like to ask you, Africa in particular will require a large stimulus package to recover from this COVID-19. Do you support another Marshall Plan, this time specifically on a new deal for growth, jobs, and sustainable development in Africa? Over to you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to all the panel for the chance to be with you today as we both celebrate Africa Day and look forward to the future of Africa and its development. Before this pandemic, I have supported strong and significant investment in order to unlock the potential of Africa's youth and to provide for more robust growth and closer partnership. I think it is important first to take a moment and look at the ways in which African leaders have responded well and quickly, taking science-based actions to swiftly lock down economies and societies across the continent. And as a result, so far, the response has gone fairly well. Because of the lessons of Ebola, the African Union and the CDC associated with it, and the current leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa has resulted in an all-star team of continent-wide leaders who are pulling together both private sector and public sector responses. But I do think there is more that the United States can and should be doing, both on our own and in partnership with many other nations. First, in order for us to recover from this pandemic, we must develop a vaccine, and the vaccine has to be made very widely available in as free and as affordable and as easily distributed a way as is possible, so that there is optimism in the world that the economies can recover, that movement and economic activity can return. I am encouraged by the recent progress of the African CFTA, by the ways in which the African Union emerged from Ebola stronger. And I support the multilateral institutions that we will need in order for all of us to prevent future pandemics and to recover from this one. Your question, Tony, was more specifically about investment, significant investment. And as you know, I was a champion for extending and reauthorizing the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which gives the continent the opportunity to trade with the United States without the sorts of trade barriers typical in other places in the world. And something I worked very hard on recently was the creation of a new development finance corporation, or DFC, that would unlock $60 billion in American investment in partnership with the African private sector and African governments to address growth opportunities. Last, I think that as the world's youngest continent, ways that we can partner to invest in and create excitement among African youth, such as the work that your foundation does around entrepreneurship, a group called Startup Africa in my own home state of Delaware that connects with entrepreneurial youth in Kenya and in other countries, are just two examples of ways we can and should do more for youth. The Young African Leaders Initiative, or YALI, that President Obama launched and that I have supported over many years now is just one more example of ways that I think we can both invest in debt relief, invest in infrastructure, but also critically invest in the human resources of Africa's youth who have tremendous potential to not just respond to and recover from this pandemic with innovation and creativity, but to lead to a stronger future for all of Africa. Thank you, Tony.
Senator Coons, I must thank you on behalf of Africa for all the support and leadership you continue to show in the U.S., especially in the Senate. I know this because when I testified in the Senate on the Electrify Africa Act, I know the role you and your colleagues played in making that, pushing that through. So thanks so much. Senator Coons, staying with you, in order to successfully flatten the curve, we need global coordination. How can we rebuild multilateralism in today's fragmented world? And what role should America be playing in building a global coalition to stem a global depression, which stares all of us in the face if nothing is done?
Well, I thank you for the question, Tony. I'm concerned about the ways in which President Trump has been pulling back from multilateral institutions like the World Health Organization. I recognize there are some concerns and questions about WHO's actions early in the unfolding of this pandemic and some concerns about transparency by the country in which this pandemic originated. But frankly, this is no time for us to be looking backwards. I think it's a critical time for us to be pulling together and looking forwards. I had the honor of visiting Liberia during the Ebola pandemic and seeing the strength and resiliency in this moment. The United States and China are currently in a fairly vigorous contest, and I think the best way that we could show the world that we have the best of intentions is if our nations were to model partnership in response to this pandemic. We have a critical need now for cutting-edge scientific research, for the development of therapeutics and vaccines, and for their distribution around the world. And if we show that organizations like the United Nations and all of its development organs and the World Health Organization enjoy uniform support around the world, I think that will strengthen confidence in the private sector and in countries around the world. And I think if we continue to fight endlessly and to threaten to cut off funds or to withdraw from multilateral institutions, I frankly think that diminishes America's role in the world. We are engaging in bilateral relief efforts around medical equipment and food supplies, but I'm someone who has long believed in the power of collective action. And on this Africa Day, I think it's particularly important that we recognize the power of collective action on the continent for the response and recovery from this pandemic, something that I think the United States should be supporting.
Thank you, Senator Coons. This is no time for finger pointing. This is a time for collaboration. This is a time for us to deal with the situation we have and also forge a better future for everyone, acting again collaboratively. Thanks so much, and please do not relent in the Senate. We need voices like you to shape the world and help us bring multilateralism back to this table. Now, let me go to my very, very good friend, Akim Steiner. Akim, as the administrator of United Nations Development Program, and Akim is an esteemed partner here in this agency of the Tony Elmelo Foundation. We work together to empower we're committed to working together to empower over 100,000 young African entrepreneurs across the 54 African states. Akim and his team decided to start with the Sahel region, where they feel that our youth are quite vulnerable and that we must all act to create economic opportunity and hope for them. Today, working together, I believe we have impacted over 3,700 people across Africa, young Africans, giving them capital, mentoring them, and providing business education learning for them to do well, to help create jobs, and usher growth on the continent. So he actually and his organization are at the forefront of this. Akim, I want to ask you, I've been very happy to participate in the roundtable session that you and your hardworking team at UNDP have convened and the productive insights that have come from it. What are some of the scalable opportunities that global and regional stakeholders should partner and support?
Thank you, Tony. And I want to also thank you for this partnership, because in the way that we have been able to focus our attention on young people is also a recognition that on the African continent, the future of development is more than perhaps anywhere else in the world premised on what it is that we can provide to young people to be able to overcome the economic constraints of still developing infrastructure, training institutions, but also very basic poverty. And I think this is in part where we now have an opportunity. We have heard a number of times already in our session, and I think the whole world is looking to, on the one hand, as the United Nations, and we are all doing, trying to protect people, first of all, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with the virus. Secondly, to mitigate its impact, social and economic impact on people and economies, and then begin to think about how do we build back better. And I think when you take the backdrop of the poster behind you, growth, jobs, and sustainable development, on the first two fronts, we are facing an unprecedented crisis. I mean, growth is collapsing, jobs are disappearing literally in the hundreds of millions. And one thing that is a particular preoccupation, I think, for all of us on this panel and for anybody who is looking at the future of development on the African continent, is also the reality that most jobs that existed were actually in the informal sector. People were not employed in a formal employment relationship. 80 to 90% of people make their living, their livelihoods, literally in the informal sector. That means when you lock down an economy from one day to the next, you not only lose your income, there is no social safety net. And this has been a tremendous challenge, I think, for all governments across the continent. And here is perhaps the first scalable solution that is not only an emergency response, but we need to look more carefully also at the efficacy of cash transfers, temporary basic incomes. What is it that with relatively limited amounts of money we can do to address extreme poverty? Because people who are in a state of extreme poverty are so much more constrained in actually being able to invest in their children, having a little bit of income with which to invest in a business, be it a corner shop, be it a workshop. And I think here is a tremendous opportunity combined with training. And perhaps two more examples, Tony, if you allow me, that I think...
Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please.
That the virus has, I think, put a spotlight on. The health system across the African continent is still very uneven. Universal health coverage is not a reality. And let's be frank, it will be very difficult for governments to finance in the near future national health services that can essentially be funded just from the public purse. We need to look at intermediate steps, micro health insurance. This is where the insurance sector, working with governments, could massively expand the coverage for hundreds of millions of people to cover the major health risks. These are the things that throw people back into poverty, and 40% of people who escape from extreme poverty actually fall back into it, often because of health crisis. We need to also look at the education sector. We talked about training, entrepreneurial skills. The reality of what's happening right now is that hundreds of millions of children are deprived of their education. And I think we have learned very quickly that digital connectivity, as the ambassador also said, could be a crucial shortcut, a leapfrogging opportunity to connect all schools across the continent to the internet, allow that as a kind of educational safety net, but also really a trampoline for jumping forward. Again, we need investments here. We need partnerships between governments, between the private sector, communities, but also the international community. And I thank Senator Coons also for, in a sense, highlighting the importance of international solidarity. You know, we lament a lot at the moment about things not working, but the truth is solidarity is alive and well. In our communities, we've seen it in the way nations across the African continent have tried to help each other and globally. The multilateral system is not some abstract political design. It is the extended hand of solidarity from one nation to another. And in the 21st century, never have we been more dependent on our ability to act together. And if this pandemic has done one thing, it is to show that, yes, we do not have the perfect institutions. None of us have the perfect responses. But how on earth would we actually contain this pandemic if we did not have a World Health Organization and if we did not have a spirit of multilateralism in our ability to act together, help each other, and ultimately achieve growth, jobs, and sustainable development, because our economies were not doing so well in terms of people's perceptions before the pandemic. We have much to reflect on, how to address inequality, poverty, lack of sustainability, and I think that may be where Africa will show us in many respects the way over the coming years. Thank you.
I like that. I like that. We're hoping to do so. On that note, let me go to Professor Oke Orama. Professor Orama, Afrexim President and CEO. First, on behalf of African private sector, I must commend the Afrexim under your leadership for your intervention of $3 billion to support trade and SME businesses through the African Bank. What is most instructive and impressive about this intervention is that this happened in a matter of weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, from approval, processing to disbursement. This is the kind of intervention that small and middle-scale enterprises on our continent need, especially at a time like this. So we say, this is not just talking about development finance intervention, this is about practicality and direct impact. In that capacity, and on that note, I want to ask you, what are the economic policy options, in your viewpoint, for our government to put in place to augment the intervention and good works of institutions like the Afrexim?
Thank you very much, Tony, again. The pandemic has shown so many weaknesses we have across our continent, not only from the point of view of infrastructure, but also the economic policies, the appropriate economic policies that will help drive growth and also help manage events of the kind we are witnessing today. Where we are is that there is a crisis. There is a crisis, but we find that in many cases, some of our governments are not very well prepared for them. Not prepared from the point of view of resources, but also the soft and hard infrastructure to deal with these kinds of situations. But if you ask me what should be the priority of our government, I think the priority of our government should be to make sure that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement gets implemented without delay. If there was any doubt about the importance of that agreement, that our leaders so courageously put in place just about 2 years ago, this COVID-19 pandemic has told us that this is the way to go. So we have to put away all reservations we have so that we can build supply chains across Africa. This is the only way we can begin to foster dynamic growth in our continent. If we do not do that, we will remain perpetual commodity exporters. And we've seen what perpetual commodity exporters suffer when we have events like this. Oil prices have crashed. Not only did it crash, there was no market for it. Nobody was ready to buy them. Some metals also suffered the same fate. At the same time, countries and companies and individuals are looking for medical supplies, pharmaceutical supplies, certain kinds of food, but we did not have the infrastructure to produce them. We did not have the capacity to produce them. We were waiting to be supplied from outside, but the supply chains were all disrupted. So the AfCFTA is the answer, and we must waste no time. We must use this opportunity to overcome whatever challenges that we may have at country levels and even collectively as a continent. Because when we start with it, we will then be able to gradually build the health infrastructure, build the manufacturing base, build the physical infrastructure that will connect us so that when we are confronted with events like this, we will be able to handle them. And we will be able to handle them because by the time we build all this, we will then begin to create bigger banks, bigger continental institutions. If I have a minute, I'll just tell you one more thing. In a continent of 1.2 billion people, 2.5 trillion in GDP, depending on how you measure it. If you take the largest developed finance institutions we have in the continent, the total aggregate total assets is less than $80 billion, less than 5% of that GDP. The Asian Development Bank alone has total assets of about $200 billion. So unless we create the infrastructure, create the market, create all those things that will make it possible for us to then have financial institutions that can finance the growth and development we need, we will remain vulnerable to the kinds of situations we have today, where although we do not have too much problem with the health issue, we do not have too many deaths, but Africa has become the epicenter of the economic devastation that the COVID-19 has unleashed upon us. Thank you.
Well, Africa has remained the epicenter of the economic effect of COVID-19 pandemic. Interesting. Okay, Oram, I want to stay with you and ask a follow-up question. Multilateral organizations have called for debt relief efforts to be stepped up. While this is good, what are some of the long-term solutions to prevent a cycle of debt accumulation and debt relief of African countries, given that not too long ago, we had debt cancellation and debt relief, and again now we're almost like knocking again. What will stop?
Well, just taking up from where I stopped, let me tell you how this debt came about. In 2006, Africa's total debt was somewhere about around $300 billion. Today is just about $1 trillion. The genesis, the increase we saw started with the first, initially, the commodity crisis that we saw in 2015, which then made many countries to run into all sorts of deficits, current account deficits, fiscal deficits, that made them now to start going again to borrow. And because many could have access to the commercial market, the bond market, and also access to other forms of borrowing, the syndicated loans market, apart from the usual sources, the bilateral sources, debt ballooned. So you see that the debt has commodity origins because the commodity prices crashed. The countries ran into fiscal problems, ran into current account problems, so they had to borrow in foreign currency. And this debt then built up. So if you want to get around it, you have to find a situation whereby you are no longer dependent so much on commodities. You now have to build a dynamic economy that is less dependent on commodities, but dependent on the kinds of goods and services which are not vulnerable to episodic shocks as we experience in Africa. I think that is the solution. The other thing that we need to do is to build a domestic capital market. Today, we have 55 countries. We have the stock exchanges are fragmented, not liquid, by small. Many economies do not have strong financial systems, and I have never seen any country, any continent that developed without a strong financial system, without banks providing funding, without a diversified source of funding growth and development. Africa does not have it. If we then have a domestic source of financing our growth, we will depend less on borrowing internationally. We will depend less on others, so that this issue of commodity prices fall, we borrow so much, and then a few years after, we ask for debt relief, we'll put to an end. So go away from commodities, develop your domestic financial markets, and you will put debt problems behind you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rama. No financial system can develop without a strong domestic sourcing and funding for growth. I agree with you. This morning, I had a meeting with the Central Bank Governor of Nigeria, and a few other private sector people. And exactly what we're speaking about, the Central Bank Governor, as usual, was sharing his passion about how to make Nigeria industrialized in the 21st century and leveraging the COVID-19, which is one of the reasons we're discussing today. How do we move Africa to the next level in spite of COVID-19 pandemic? Let me go to Peter Mora of the ICRC. The ICRC is another partner of the Tony Elumelu Foundation. In fact, they were the first multilateral development organization to partner with the Tony Elumelu Foundation. Together, we have empowered vulnerable communities in the Niger Delta and the northeastern region of Nigeria. Peter, how have you rated the global public health response to COVID-19 pandemic, and what more can we do to minimize the effect of the pandemic? And what also, realizing the new focus of ICRC, not about dealing with post, but about stemming and making sure it does not happen. What are your thoughts in this area?
Well, I would say it's about combining the past way of doing with the future. I think if you look at Africa today, it is unquestioned that a lot of vulnerable populations have been heavily affected by the pandemic, beforehand by poverty and conflict. And unfortunately, for many of those, for women, children, the elderly, those with multiple health challenges, in particularly fragile and conflict-ridden places in Africa, there is no much alternative in the first stage to increase humanitarian assistance, emergency assistance, and to help them survive. But here, Tony, I think what has brought us together is that I'm deeply convinced that we can't stop there. We must do more than just life-saving. And I think that's where this discussion today is so important. I think two things need to follow after life-saving. First, and it has been alluded to in the discussion already, this pandemic has illustrated the weakness of systems, health systems, water and sanitation system, food systems, social systems overall, and we have to heavily invest, private and public sectors, into the stabilization of health systems. This needs new innovative finance. It can't be financed just over tax income. And so when I say stabilizing system, it is really combining our experience from frontline help and from frontline emergency assistance to translate it into long-term system stabilization. And health is, of course, in areas of pandemics, the first address which we have to look at. This is also the recognition and lessons learned from Ebola and other pandemics. We need to look at pandemics as part of a broader health systems which needs stabilization. The same is true for water, sanitation, basic infrastructure, and social services. Today, for instance, the ICRC is launching a pilot project on a humanitarian impact bond to finance water and sanitation system in Goma. I think it is important to combine our system approach with new innovative finance. And the second part is that's where we have cooperated in the past and we are eager to cooperate in the future. Investment has always gone into the more developed parts of Africa and not in the most fragile parts of Africa. And I think where we are interested is to stabilize the most fragile parts of Africa. That's where Tony Elumelu and myself partnered together in the north of Nigeria, in the Delta, in other parts of Africa, in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa. And I think we need those private-public partnerships, those multi-stakeholder cooperations where we support youth, innovative youth, to build, to engage in innovations, in entrepreneurship, to build markets. We need to do that much earlier than we used in the past. We must prevent that humanitarian assistance just becomes a self-perpetuating system. And we have to design the pathway out. And the pathway out of dependency towards autonomy and self-fulfilling jobs and income is only going through partnership, innovation, investment in the most fragile context. And I think that's where the new type of partnership is so badly needed. And that's, I would say, the pathway we have to encounter. 3 words just to illustrate what is really opportunities today. The localization of work and attention through pandemics has rapidly accelerated. This is really tuned and tailored to African communities' resilience. Secondly, the virtualization for our work of Africa, which are the most reliant pillar, and they would have probably deserved a bigger audience also in that podium.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much. I like that. You know, I'm surrounded by women in my house.
Knowles Television, reaching you live from Lagos, Nigeria. And you've been watching the UBA Africa Day Conversation 2020 with the theme Growth, Jobs and Sustainable Development Amidst a Global Pandemic. That's where we bring an end to that. Now we continue with our usual programming for the day. Please stay with us.